Jordan Thomas, what is your favorite game?
My favorite game is Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition through the virtual tabletop software Fantasy Grounds. So, I mean, it would have started with a board game called Talisman when I was very young. I didn't really have access to a great computer yet, but Talisman was this incredibly sort of expansive kind of D&D light game that my childhood friends and I would sit around a low coffee table in my grandmother's house on awful green carpet at the time, and sort of roll dice and embody our little characters, and we bought all the expansions and just got really immersed in it and would just while away hours and hours to the delight and perhaps a little bit of fear of our parents. And then my dad brought home an IBM PC Junior, and I got into a number of games, the most sort of crystallized of which was the Sierra Adventure Game series. On PC, the PC Junior, and so I really fell in. King's Quest, Quest for Glory, then called Heroes Quest, and Space Quest. These that offered this window into a place that where the imagination was realized and had a sort of landscape, and you could navigate it cogently, and so the reader in me appreciated the sort of story that was being told, but the explorer in me was just thrilled at what a computer game could offer in terms of consistency. And so that snowballed into a strong desire to make games for a living. And so I started to learn to program and Visual Basic and so forth. And weirdly enough, given what we're talking about today, my very first attempted game was, in fact, a way ahead of its time, I guess, virtual tabletop software. My best friend and I would spend all of our evenings trying to build this game together, and the influence from Dungeons and Dragons and Talisman and all of those things kind of sort of fused into this desire to make games. And so I played everything under the sun, primarily focused on RPGs, and eventually had a sort of second major romance during my college years with the genre which has been termed the immersive simulation. So Deus Ex, Thief, System Shock 2, games like this that allow the player a great degree of creative freedom within solving an otherwise kind of action or RPG problem. And I got my first job as a game designer working on actually a terrible Harry Potter port, but not port, but a terrible Harry Potter sort of licensed title. But it taught me Unreal, and I was able to eventually parlay that into a job on the third Thief game, where I made a very scary mission that got some small renown, and since then continued to play games as much as possible. The Bethesdas and BioWares especially have been my constant companions, and moved on to work on all three BioShock games, and recently went independent to make my first completely indie sort of artsy title called The Magic Circle.
And we'll touch upon that in a little while, but you mentioned how immersive, like, this is my forte in terms of not virtual games, but proper video games and not tabletop games, and we'll come to that in a second. But you mentioned the Bethesdas and the BioWares. Like, how much have you played of Fallout 4 as of late? Like, because
I finished Fallout 4 more or less 2 weeks after it was released, and that's just because I didn't want to miss anything. Granted, the DLC has just been released, so I'm excited to go back into that world, but every Fallout I have consumed like it was some sort of life-saving shipment of of morphine or something. Like a pain that I didn't know was so keen until moments before it comes out, and that it is my opiate. So I have very good friends on that game also, Emil Pagliarulo and Pete Hines. And we used to work together, and so I eagerly anticipate each of their sort of, I don't know, just takes on that series. And so, I crushed it, and maybe a little bit too fast, to be honest. But I'm very proud of my character, Gala Main Nation, the sort of Politico who saved the wasteland.
Oh, wow. Oh god, I've just lost my train of thought just then.
Yeah, sorry. It's just, she does that.
I was before we were just starting, and I'm actually just come across again here. Like, there's this story I came across on Facebook just before we started recording. It was about Skyrim, and how one user on Twitter was just basically tweeting this long story of how, in fact, it was yesterday, of how he was tweeting his story in Skyrim, and where he had found a dog whose owner had died in the cabin, and then he adopted it, and then he had to go through all sorts of things to keep the dog, such as adopting a child, bringing back this brand new kind of, it's difficult to describe. I'm going to actually send it your way on Skype, because because I think you should definitely see this. But the point I'm trying to underline here is that Bethesda games and BioWare games as well, but as we're talking about Bethesda games, that's kind of the point. Like, they provide you their own stories. Like, there's always that certain experience in which you can say, alright, this is where Bethesda RPGs shine. They give you the platform to, even if they have a kind of nailed in stone story, such as in Fallout 4 you have to go out and find your kid, there's these kind of, I'm trying to think of the right term here, but they do give you this platform in a way to sort of provide your own stories.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, don't let me interrupt, but I definitely, my entire career, and indeed to some extent before I understood how to articulate these principles, my relationship to games has been a sort of romance with that idea of singing a duet between the designer and player, a sort of contract that emerges between the creator and this wild sort of tornado of intent that sort of wanders into their garden, and they have to find some way to sort of allow it its play without decimating all kind of authorial influence. And so the Bethesda games in particular, I think, have that wonderful sort of Promethean spirit, that although they have a huge world and they want desperately for you to kind of commune with it, they allow you to convince yourself. They give you enough control over the horizontal and the vertical that you, as a co-author, are welcome, and you know it. And so that's why I lose myself in those games. I haven't seen this story about the dog yet, but I have a similar experience in that one of the DLCs for Fallout 3 involved, without trying to spoil too much, involved a baby as the sort of MacGuffin, and a physicalized baby in a little sort of space coffin that prevented it from taking any real obvious damage. But you have access to this object, and at some point it gets, you can move it between factions in the story. And I essentially ended my experience with that game by collecting toys from around the wasteland and supplies and surrounding this kid with the best possible life that I could give it, and then walking into the crater of Megaton and letting the radiation from my own act kill my character. Because it was a much more interesting ending for me than any specific, kind of authored one. But they gave me so many tools and so much fertile context that I was able to sort of convince myself of the catharsis there.
I'll be honest, I'll be upfront, I've not finished any Bethesda RPGs. I should say that up front. But I'll admit that in terms of the BioWare games, I've obviously finished all the Mass Effect trilogy, so yeah. Although that kind of brings up another point, like in terms of story in modern RPGs, like what about characters in modern RPGs? How do you think modern RPGs handle the character side, anyways? Because I think for me, Mass Effect is defined by its characters, anyways.
Well, I think it is depending on which BioWare RPG. They are points on a line, and there's a powerful spectrum in terms of where modern RPGs have diverged, where on the one side there are studios like BioWare that have doubled down on improving the quality of their writing above all, and so you are going to feel like you met some real people who lived in that world come hell or high water, sometimes to the detriment of the development of your own. They have a very strong sort of authorial voice, and they're not shy about funneling you to the end that their story needs you to experience in order for all of that character to be properly expressed and tested like it would be in a traditional TV show, movie, or book. Bethesda, I think, is much further along the spectrum towards the primacy of the player, where the identity that you've built is by far the most important. Sometimes to almost absurdist kind of ends, in the sense that like you can be the head of every guild, deeply contradictory guilds, and nobody says boo about it. But the people who need that in their lives, that notion of freedom above all, find something that the BioWare games lack. So I enjoy both as kind of fire and ice. Like I need those extremes.
Right then, let's get into your favourite game, Fantasy Grounds, which actually, going back to what you said in the introduction, is Dungeons and Dragons by effect. So, up front, I'm going to say this. I said this to Jordan before we started recording, but this kind of ties it back in to what Jordan's perhaps about to sell me on in regards to Fantasy Grounds, anyways, and that I've never played a pen and paper RPG in my life. The closest I've come to playing RPGs is, like we've been discussing, the modern type of video game RPGs, like Bethesda, like BioWare, like Square Enix with Final Fantasy, or Deus Ex to a lesser extent, I guess. You mentioned a bit about how you first started playing pen and paper RPGs when you first started getting into playing games. Like, delve into that a little bit more. Like, what other games were you getting into in terms of pen and paper RPGs?
I think the first one we had access to was an edition of Dungeons and Dragons. But to be honest, its rules were arcane enough that I think that the sort of elements that I fell in love with later in my career, which are the sort of really artful expression of rules and mastery over rules that games do so well, we were not equipped mentally to deal with yet, and so it became a very sort of shopping spree kind of dungeon hack kind of game, abstractly rendered by me for the players. They really had a blast with it, but we didn't understand it fully. As we got older, we experimented with White Wolf games. Our favorite was Mage, which sort of states that reality is a consensus, and that the reason why science has sort of won our world is because of a long, structured argument against magic, and you sort of play people who are on the fringes, still able to work magic, but who are being hunted by the forces that want to keep the world rational and science-bound. And so that was really cool, and as we were growing into our late teens, nurtured the rebellious impulse, I guess, and then when I got my first job working with the 3 and Deus Ex guys, the Deus Ex design team was this just really intimidatingly smart and charismatic group that needed another for their regular D&D game. And so I was lucky enough to sort of get into that slot while working on Thief 3. And they reintroduced me to the game, to Dungeons & Dragons, and showed me the incredible freedom that you can offer players if you as the referee internalize the rules enough that nobody feels like anyone is cheating or that the DM is overly biased. If essentially you as game designer don't allow yourself to be lazy on any front, but still say yes to the player when they ask if they can do something outside the box. And so it changed my life. Like since then, I have wanted to play tabletop games as much or more than video games, and was really bounded by physical opportunity. The best thing about a tabletop game is having the right people to play with. And coming around to sort of your next question, I hope Fantasy Grounds, interestingly, is one of many virtual tabletop solutions, but it's one of the sort of larger and more sophisticated ones, and it helps, I think, people play with those friends no matter where they might live, and to an extent cuts down on the physical organization problem of getting X number of people who maybe in their 30s or 40s into the same room for 4 hours.
Absolutely, and yeah, you'd be right in saying that my next question is essentially the elevator pitch for Fantasy Grounds, because, you mentioned it yourself. Like, I said to Steve before we started recording, in that there's not really anyone here where I live. I live in Northern Ireland, and there'd be no one here in my hometown who'd be interested in playing like pen and paper RPGs at all. But with something like Fantasy Grounds, there is no excuse. So basically pitch it to me as if I want to try out Fantasy Grounds and try pen and paper RPGs for the first time.
Fantasy Grounds is a virtual tabletop application which you can buy through Steam or outside of Steam if you prefer. And what it does is connect players together through a kind of lobby, similar to a multiplayer shooter or really any sort of cooperative multiplayer game. And the Dungeon Master or Game Master is able to push content to those people, and they see it at their own PC. And usually they use something like this, like Skype, or I use GoToMeeting for video, or at least audio, so that everybody's able to speak as if they were at the table. And it has virtual dice, which you roll to arbitrate game decisions and options. And you can see your character there, and you can see everybody else's character. And if I say, we're all going to fight now, you will see a map suddenly appear with a grid on it, and your little character will be on there, and you can move it around. And it still relies on the Game Master like a tabletop game would. We played with books and dice, except that it saves a lot of time, and it saves you from doing a lot of the math that people find intimidating when they move from either video games or just no gaming at all to an RPG for the first time. In particular, Fantasy Grounds has the official license from Wizards of the Coast, so every single module of Dungeons & Dragons content, from first level all the way up through 20, immediately, or nearly immediately, comes out available through Fantasy Grounds as a completely digital wiki that you can browse around in, steal the parts that you like, and discard the rest. And that is huge for people who are new to it. So pre-generated adventures, as they are called, are these sort of huge books of, here's what happens when you walk into this room. Around this corner, there is a trap. Around this corner, there are these 3 orcs and a sort of nasty bat creature that is hovering on the ceiling. And if the players get too far in, the bat falls on their heads. And the Game Master reads all of that stuff and decides, okay, here's how I'm going to interpret that. Here's how I'm going to run this for my player group. And so you guys say what you're going to do, and I would ask you to roll dice, and everyone can see the result of your dice, but you can't see the result of mine. Secrecy is one of the privileges of the Game Master, and so you put together this adventure, and it gives you a starting place. A custom campaign setting is the sort of ambitious thing that a lot of new writers and game designers are scared of it when somebody says, can you Game Master a tabletop game? But Wizards of the Coast puts out these wonderful modules that you can run and get familiar with the structure without having to do all the writing yourself.
How does Fantasy Grounds deal with the ease of access with new players? Because you mentioned there how you can discard some elements of it and keep the elements that you like, and like you said yourself that is a godsend for new players. But how does Fantasy Grounds kind of treat any new players towards the pen and paper genre?
Well, there's a few different important answers to that. One of them is that I should hasten to add that the full version of Fantasy Grounds is pricey compared to other virtual tabletop software. There's Roll20 and other solutions like that which are free, Roll20.net. But Fantasy Grounds has a lot built into its software that you pay for, and what I have done is gotten a subscription so that my players can play for free. So that's the first barrier to entry for a lot of people is the price tag with Fantasy Grounds. I want to mention it, but there are ways around it. I know of groups where the groups decided to throw in for the Game Master's original subscription, but then from that point onward, there's no obligation. New players can join using the demo version and play for free. So putting price aside for a second, there's good news and bad news on the accessibility front. The good news is that as with all, the reason why it's so addictive for a person like me is that when you're designing a game for somebody or even running a game for somebody, feedback usually comes after you've already failed. So if you're a video game maker, and a player has a poor experience, there's no way for you to revise in real time. You can't react to that. So Fantasy Grounds benefits from the fact that if I have exposure to the rules, I can sort of dole them out for you as you're playing your first game. So players have that benefit of a live referee who has some exposure to the software. The downside is that unlike a lot of really expensive video games, there's no sophisticated tutorial. It's not going to pop up and tell you what to do to start playing from zero. They have a series of tutorial videos which are available on YouTube for free, and that's how I learned to arbitrate play through the software.
And just to touch upon Fantasy Grounds itself, and I should mention up front, most of my questions are on Fantasy Grounds, not D&D, so feel free to jump in at any point with any Dungeons and Dragons stuff related to it. But yeah, it's not just D&D Fantasy Grounds has. It basically has every pen and paper RPG under the sun that uses the core RPG rule set, like Call of Cthulhu, Savage Worlds, Deadlands, etc.
Yes, that's right. One of the lovely things about their current library is that it treats all of those rule sets like DLC, and a lot of them are quite cheap. So you can plug in the entire rule set for D20 Modern or Call of Cthulhu or whatever you like to play. The main reason I mentioned D&D first was because of the immense amount of playtesting D&D gets, and that can really help new players feel at home. But yeah, if you're more experienced and you're into the more arcane stuff, they have all of those rule sets as well. And this is only for use in private games, but the other great thing about it is you can import maps that people have made on the internet and release for free, and just be using them incredibly quickly. You just right click and say add grid, and you're good to go. So a lot of the prep time for running a game, at least for me, is radically different. I am able to get a session ready for my players with maybe an hour of prep time before they arrive, whereas my traditional tabletop experiences, it took quite a bit more time than that. And that may be because I over-prepare, but I don't know, Fantasy Grounds makes that easier on me. But jumping back to your sort of original question of why play a tabletop game, and specifically through Fantasy Grounds, well, tabletop games allow you to really do anything. That feeling that you're speaking to a canned character who has very strong bounds to what they can say and what they can respond to, haunts every computer RPG. No matter how well written, like let's say Planescape Torment, which is famous for this, went to great lengths to make you feel like you could lie, but say the same thing as telling the truth, and allowing you to express the way that your character talks, but it still runs into boundaries, and not all of the conversations have that kind of depth. The beauty of D&D or really any tabletop game is that as long as your game master is sort of a good improviser, you can push at the walls of the world and find adventure where nobody, including the game master, was expecting it, and you end up laughing sort of riotously because of the improv that you kind of are all pulling off together. Fantasy Grounds just seems to facilitate that in a way that getting a bunch of people in a room together, while still fantastic, and I would never recommend that people who can do that don't. I've found that people actually show up and play consistently with virtual tabletops because they, how else are they going to kill a Sunday night? It's a nice, comfortable way to game.
At the same time, though, like, does the fact that you are playing on this virtual software like kind of kill the intimacy that you would perhaps get with a physical game with, like, I don't know, say like 3 or 4 people or whatever they're playing on a Sunday night, like for 3 or 4 hours at a time?
Well, that's a very good question, and I think the answer is fairly dimensional. So a bit of a mixed bag, I guess. So on the one hand, there is no substitute for face-to-face contact, particularly among strangers who are trying to learn to trust each other for the first time. However, that's massively intimidating for another type of personality. And so, as I was mentioning to you before the show officially started, it does offer a kind of safety to be in your own space. And so for some people, safety is more important than intimacy, if that makes sense, certainly early on. And secondly, though, I can say that in the games that I've run, who are people who either knew each other or got to know each other pretty fast, the conversations very quickly turn to, arguably more intimate in some ways than they might have been in a party scenario, which you can't really shake completely when you have people over to your house. Some very real topics have been discussed, which we had to sort of derail the game for a couple times, and I think we were all very much closer afterwards when that stuff was talked through. So, in my experience, intimacy is kind of a function of the built-up kind of trust and personality that you aggregate when you bring a gaming group together, and so it can survive a lot of different mediums. But I would never say that people who have access to an in-person game shouldn't try that first, because you learn a lot, and there is a certain comfort in not dealing with people talking over each other over video conference and so forth. Like, that has collision issues, and you have to learn a sort of etiquette to pull off a table-like feel online.
No, I can totally get that. I mean, like that. Yeah, it would kind of break that kind of intimacy.
And it can. And I just state the rules very clearly. And I think it's actually made everybody more respectful players, to be honest. But I have a little bit of confirmation bias going. Like my Fantasy Grounds games have gone so well, even in part compared to some of the ones that I run in person in the past, that the handicap of the sort of online component does not it doesn't significantly affect my current feeling about virtual tabletop play. Like the trade-off has been worth it.
Just to slightly go back, like you mentioned how it takes, like in Fantasy Grounds, it usually takes about an hour to prep for a game. Like, how long would it take for a physical kind of game?
Well, I make my own maps, so your mileage may vary on this, but I like, because I'm a video game designer, I enjoy a very strong and consistent set of tactical rules that combat encounters need to be resolved through. And I think visually. So one of the best ways to do that is to build your own grid or hex battle maps. And I don't do it with the terrain. Like, I'm not one of those super powered hobbyists that like has 3D versions of every possible physical scenario and builds it out of models. But I do draw fairly complex battle maps and fairly detailed battle maps, and that's the standard that I've sort of set for myself, and which I have easy access to through Fantasy Grounds. But doing that all by hand tends to take in the neighborhood of 3 or 4 hours, and that includes the prep of the content, the encounters, what parts of the story I intend the players to kind of stumble on.
Wow.
Yeah.
I mean, like, I guess in that aspect you would need to invest a heavy load of time, like free time, to kind of prep for that. Like, that'd be kind of off-putting maybe to someone coming in, perhaps.
Well, I will. I mean, I'm not gonna sell you a bill of goods. Like the truth is that game mastering is hard. It is not for everyone. There are running, for example, a pre-generated adventure. As I mentioned, like for example, and I'll talk about this at the end too. But I'm about to run Curse of Strahd, which is a Ravenloft-centric D&D adventure that just released by Wizards of the Coast, very non-linear and video game-like, for a group of fairly well-known folks from all over the game industry, and it's going to be really cool, and I can't wait to sort of share it with everybody. And I'm doing that in part because of the playtesting that all Wizards content goes through. But the point that I was about to make was that is much less intimidating because everything that's supposed to happen in any given area is planned for you. And if you want to color outside the lines, go ahead. Nobody's there to tell you no. But you've always got something if the player says, I go right, and you were hoping they would go left. There is an answer to that. So it's way less intimidating to first start out by either refereeing, game mastering, or dungeon mastering, depending on your chosen term, a pre-generated adventure first. And because the Wizard stuff is so good, and because Fantasy Grounds has the sole license to use all of that content in a form where it's already available to you, as opposed to having to be input by hand, I strongly recommend it if you're thinking about running a game. But for players, the prep is much less painful. You talk to your game master about what kind of character you want to play, and show up with a good attitude. That is at least how I try to make it for in the same way that some people love to host parties, and there's a huge amount of work involved in hosting a party, and I'm one of those people when it comes to games. But I try to make my players have a completely sort of seamless experience where they just relax into it.
I mean, like when you do these kind of D&D games, like whether it be physical sense or on somewhere like Fantasy Grounds, like what is the kind of atmosphere like, at least in terms of your games, anyways?
Well, I would say that coming back to spectrum between ultra expressive rules with a ton of freedom like a sport, and at the other end of the spectrum a novel or more kindly choose your own adventure novel where you just sort of walk left to right and you're told what happens there, no matter how well written it might be. Mine fall on the narratively biased side, but I still try to build into it that sort of Deus Ex, System Shock kind of sense that the rules matter here. What powers you choose and in what order, what your stats are, all of that will affect your survivability or your array of options throughout your adventure. So I would say I lean heavier on the flavor stuff and the deep backstory and that kind of thing. The private game that I'm running for a group of professional writers is a completely custom setting. It draws influence from the Dark Tower series, Dune, D&D, of course, because that's the rule set, Dark Sun, all that kind of stuff. But it is none of those things sort of in a vacuum. It is its own animal, and I get a lot out of that, but it's also the most amount of work. The game that I'm about to run on YouTube and possibly eventually Twitch for this group of game folks is going to be pre-generated, and I am going to throw all of the work that I would usually put into the custom setting into like interesting and deep playable backstory for the characters. And so giving them some of that Dragon Age Origins feel where you actually get to live your origin story. Hopefully leading to a much more invested player and audience by the time they see them join the main party.
This might be a bit of a weird question, but I'm going to I realize I say this as a tabletop noob, but I'm going to ask it anyways.
Yes, Dungeons & Dragons can turn into an orgy. No, wait, no, that's not...
and to tie it back into what I actually do know, which is video games. You mentioned that kind of narrative focus with your games and of choice, and with games like Deus Ex, like with FIFA and all that there, and Dragon Age, and like for more recent examples, Fallout and Skyrim in terms of you can choose your own skills, your own story, and all that there. But what about choice-driven games? Like, maybe this is the wrong example of what I'm thinking of here, but like the choice-driven games, something like the episodic stuff, like Telltale or Life is Strange. Maybe this is the wrong comparison I'm like thinking of here. And do bear in mind, I am such a tabletop noob, but like, does that kind of play influence, so to speak, with tabletop, and or maybe vice versa even?
Yes, in the sense that because Telltale, for example, has invested so heavily in conversation being the primary mechanic, your relationship to other characters and the choices you make in the story being all they care about, really. There is heavy overlap between that and a well-run session of D&D because conversation is so natural, because unlike having to type in what you want to say or choose from a pre-generated array of options, you can just ask. Or just verbally abuse, or just plead with, or propose to, or whatever it is, the whim that might strike you at that moment. And a GM who at least loves one of the things that D&D does better than video games will respond well to that and say, okay, I'm going to make sure this character references back to the fact that you tried to kneel down and propose to her in Act 1. And so there, I think that I would be stunned if Telltale were not big tabletop RPG players, and I know some of them certainly were. So, the fans of games like that can enjoy a D&D or really just any tabletop role-playing game. But depending on their game master, they might find themselves overwhelmed by rules. Like a game that you can absolutely get a mismatch between game master and player in the same way that you can between psychotherapist and patient, where this somebody who's unsympathetic to sort of the softer stuff and only wants to know how much damage you can do with your sword is maybe not going to run the kind of game that you're going to enjoy if you deeply love Telltale and other adventure games that focus on dialogue and plot.
I was talking to Chris Avalon actually for this show quite a few weeks back, and his favourite game that he picked was Wasteland, and obviously that has a big kind of tabletop RPG influence. Like, what other games, like modern video games at least, have had that kind of influence, so to speak?
Well, so one of the ones that stands out to me, which invokes the part of my brain I associate with a great tabletop game, and thinking here of this sort of half horror campaign that was run by Steve Powers, one of the Deus Ex designers, is Darkest Dungeon. You were asking about honorable mentions. Darkest Dungeon looms large in my head because the incredible stress that deeply flawed adventurers would feel if their job was full-time to go into, just the abysses of the earth and try to bring treasure out, fighting monsters full-time, would drive you mad. And, humans were not meant for that. And so there's a great overlap between tabletop games that have a Call of Cthulhu flavor or a horror flavor, and a high lethality kind of or an aggressive lethality curve with Darkest Dungeon. I can't recommend it enough. Like it's the other thing about it is that it's not full of 3D characters doing animations with like lots of particle effects. It is a hand drawn style with a Mike Mignola kind of flair. Deep blacks. A lot is unknown, and that's what playing a tabletop RPG can really sort of touch in you, that sense of 4 against the unknown or 6 against the unknown.
So yeah, just to kind of slide back into Fantasy Grounds then, like, how does Fantasy Grounds itself handle compared to, say, other virtual tabletop programs? Like you mentioned one of them there, like there's Roll20, but there's also D20 Pro, Game Table, etc. Like how does Fantasy Grounds like stack up to those?
Well, the interface is significantly different. Fantasy Grounds has a lot of layers to its interface, and I have heard people very strongly advocate for one or the other. Fantasy Grounds lets you do like a sort of virtual fog of war and draw in the regions as the players wander through it. I don't have a ton of experience with Roll20, to be honest with you, and that's the other big popular one. I know that, you know, the one of the biggest differences is the number of rule sets which are already and legally pre-programmed in. My high level sort of preference for Fantasy Grounds descends from the fact that so much of it works so much like a video game, that the way that it handles icons, maps, dice, all those things, they all go through a parser that will be very familiar to you if you've played something like Planescape or really any game, any MMO, where you can see, you know, people's attacks resolve and fail in a chat window. Critical Hit, which is a really great, somewhat lesser known but really great D&D podcast, plays with Roll20, and so I would definitely encourage people who want to know what it's like to play a game with one of the cheaper virtual tabletop options to give that a listen.
We mentioned the kind of difficulties and perhaps in starting out in tabletop and Fantasy Grounds in particular. One of them is the fact that I was looking at Steam earlier at the store page for Fantasy Grounds, and like it's £40 sterling for the base software, but you mentioned it yourself, like there's so much downloadable content that it adds up to around £230 sterling. It's a massive financial commitment to make, anyways. Like whether it be a virtual tabletop like Fantasy Grounds or even physical aspect, anyways.
Yeah, I mean that is absolutely true, and you know I think done wrong, it could definitely end up just being the Cadillac of virtual tabletop options, and therefore not for as many people. But the truth is that actual physical copies of Wizards of the Coast 5th edition books are themselves extremely expensive. Most of those are nearly one-to-one with their equivalent in Fantasy Grounds. And I don't know about you, and this may just paint me as a terrible person, but I have lost my patience for leafing back and forward through text. I now think in Wiki. And the fact that they have extrapolated all that material already and organized it into quick shortcuts and links and table of contents that you can quickly get back to has been game changer for me. So the expense of the few books for me as the game master has been worth it. However, a couple of things are important to say. First, it is commendable that Wizards of the Coast released the basic rules for D&D for free, and for like I think $3.49 or similar, you can get the Fantasy Grounds equivalent of what Wizards has offered for free for you know people to run at regular tables. So you can test D&D in its sort of atomic form without buying the really complicated books, even through Fantasy Grounds. And then secondarily, because it allows, I think it's up to 4 players, but don't quote me, to log in on a single license, you can split one subscription and have at least one player come in for free, possibly more, and then beyond that, once logged into my computer, you have my whole library just as you would as if you would come to my house. So if I set up a Fantasy Grounds server and say, you guys, the server's alias today is this, you can make characters, log in, save them to my server, and just leave it without paying dime one. And that, I think, is the real hidden strength, is that if you go onto Steam and look at Fantasy Grounds, it can seem really intimidating as a player who doesn't want to spend all that money, but you really don't have to.
Yeah, it's worth noting, like, you can just pick and choose whatever packs that you fancy, so it's worth bearing that in mind. But still, like, £230 odd, like, it is really off-putting if you really want to kind of go for broke.
You mean all the? You mean if you buy all the DLCs or all the Wizards? Like, where is that price coming from?
It's coming from the Steam page, although I think that might just be DLC itself. So
yeah,
maybe
That is all the DLC. The core game is $40.
Mm.
And so the individual pieces of DLC cost in the $19.99, $15.99, $10, and like I say, the core rules for D&D is like $3.50. So that $200 is definitely not what the average person pays for using the software. Like my first group of 4 each bought a copy themselves, and that was it. The rest of the libraries and stuff they got from me.
Mm. Fair enough. No, I think I just got it very mixed up. So
Yeah, and I think that's the thing is, Steam makes it easy to say buy this game and all its DLC, and if you look at that price tag, you're going to be like, oh my god, what is this? Does it come with powdered diamond? You know.
I'm just going to double check the Steam page again because, like, yeah, it is quite insane. Regardless of how it's rather DLC or the add-on packs itself, it is quite an expensive taste, anyways.
Yeah, no, and look, here's the thing: as a video game designer who just put out a fairly short game on Steam, like one of the biggest complaints that I frequently see from people is that this didn't last long enough to justify my dollar. And the truth is that $40 is less than the video games that I purchase regularly. Like, that's just the reality. Like, a AAA video game is just this insane amount. And I'm able to play tabletop games through it with other players ad infinitum. Like, I've already, in terms of hours spent with the software, crushed almost any other single PC game that I own. And so it's one of those things where it depends on sort of what is more important to you, your money or your time. And in my case, $40 to save me the amount of time that Fantasy Grounds has proven to be one of the best investments in gaming that I've made, possibly my entire life. And that's why when you asked what my favorite game was, I said it's a deeply conflicted thing for me to try to answer, but this game actually has changed the way that I think about my entertainment time, possibly forever. Like, I enjoy it more than most video games by an order of magnitude. And so I can't understate that. You know, I'll never regret a dollar spent on Fantasy Ground.
Fair enough. Like, that's a good way of putting it. Yeah, how many hours are you willing to admit that you've put into Fantasy Grounds? Like, either per D&D game or overall? Like, how many? Yeah, just like, are you willing?
Well, not counting. It's difficult because a lot of the reading that I've done outside of game informs the way that I intend to use Fantasy Grounds, but it's definitely in the multiple hundreds at this point because I'm running several games, and I do a lot of prep work because I find it interesting. I mean, one thing that's important to note, and I don't. Again, I'm not trying to sell any snake oil here. I'm not affiliated with Smiteworks. Like, I think that maybe the guy knows I love the game because I'm tweeting at him from time to time. But the truth is that I am a professional game designer, right? And so what I'm going to find fun as in terms of being a referee of a tabletop game, parts of my brain light up that might not for you or for somebody else who would buy the software. But they could try a pre-gen adventure and potentially have a huge blast sort of talking and drinking with their friends online without the sort of creative overhead that I need in my life. This energy that I put into Fantasy Grounds would otherwise just go to wasted notebooks full of ideas. And I love the fact that they're actually becoming experiences for people, and specifically tailor-made experiences, because that same feedback loop I was telling you about before, where actually feedback loop's the wrong term, the cycle of iteration of putting a game out, receiving feedback from players, and then making changes happens in real time. And that is unbelievably addictive. And I think that people who aren't professional game designers can at least enjoy the improv joke of it, the cracking your friends up when, he decides to kick the dragon in the nuts. And there's no particular rule for what kicking the dragon in the nuts actually does, so you have to work it out.
Oh dear, I think you've just sold me on that instance. Dragon Ball punching, kicking, amazing scenes. um, so in terms of Fantasy Grounds itself, anyways, like, what else did you like about it that we've not touched upon tonight?
Oh, that's a good question. God. I guess I want to double down on something that I only glanced on, which is that the math component of tabletop RPGs turns off a lot of people. A lot of people. And honestly, even the rules monger types who are, I love those guys because I've worked with them for years, and I'm always trying to be a little more like them, but I'll never have enough levels in Wizard, if you know what I mean. They seem to respond very well to the fact that what Fantasy Grounds lets you do is, let's say we're talking about lock picking, and I say to you, okay, this lock is of pretty good make. It is a difficulty of 15 in order to open it. And you're like, okay, well, I have a +5 lockpicking skill. If you ask a person sitting at a table to roll a d20 and add the result of that d20 together with their 5 in lockpicking skill, their brains just seize up sometimes. It's like, I've had a long day. I don't necessarily want to do even simple math over and over and over again to move forward. So what Fantasy Grounds lets you do, and I must hasten to add that this does somewhat reduce the educational component that D&D can have for kids. Like, I actually strongly recommend that kids play D&D in person first because the math is good for them. But you click lockpicking, and a D20 magically appears on your mouse cursor, and you drag it over into the chat window, and it pre-computes your lockpicking bonus. So if you rolled a 10, your bonus of 5 gets you up to 15, and that lock pops open, and the DM or GM can go on with the game without the player who's a little slower on math digging for a calculator or going, hang on, that kind of stuff. And the fluidity that comes out of it has been a game changer for the types of players that I'm able to engage in tabletop. So I just need to make sure that comes across, because I really think, and look, I used to be one of these players. Like, my math has gotten better because I run in-person games, but it's one of those things where I think it removes so many barriers to entry and just lets you focus on the best parts, which are the sort of team improv and planning and consequences.
What is there about Fantasy Grounds that you didn't like about it? What you don't like about it, even?
Hang on a second. There's actually there are a few things, and I want to make sure I don't miss them, because I have talked about this once before, and I think I did miss one. So one of the big ones that does sort of trouble me is that I think once you say to somebody that you're going to have Photoshop-like functionality of being able to draw on the map and create a dynamic fog of war that you can reveal, you start to want things like layers, sets of tokens that can be easily put into a group and then revealed and hidden quickly. It has no video chat or audio chat component of its own. So I know for some people that's going to be a barrier to entry because they have to have Skype or something running in tandem. It has stability issues, at least for me, if you open zillions and zillions of books and supplements at once. But that you really do have to kind of break the bank with that. Like I should mention that only has happened to me when I have everything that Wizards has released open at the same time. Let's see, there are some other ones too. Offhand I can't think of it, but basically it comes down to that the features that you want when you're making your own maps can often feel a little bit limiting, and some of the, I mean, to be honest, that tutorial stuff we touched on it before. Like, I really think that because so much of it plays like a video game, you do expect in-game tutorialization. So, for example, the features that allow you to place a fireball spell and to know exactly who will be affected in that radius are a little arcane and require a bit of digging to discover. They exist and they're not bad, but
having to delve into a tutorial video and find the exact part of the tutorial video where that happens, I would say can be challenging for people, and certainly meant that when I first started running games in Fantasy Grounds, I lost a little bit of time to saying like, oh, okay, actually I had that rule wrong, or I don't know where to find that kind of thing.
Is there anything you change from a design perspective, at least in terms of Fantasy Grounds? I don't know.
Yeah, I would love the ability to grant Game Master powers to a second account so that you can have certain roles and other features be made in public to ease with streaming. So it's a pretty deep cut in terms of who this would affect, but this is a streaming world now, so maybe it will matter to some of your listeners. There are certain features that only the Game Master can see, and for me personally, I would love the ability to easily divide those levels of privilege between different types of players, so that I can have a pseudo player running in parallel who can see some of what I can see, but not all of it. Not enough to spoil people who want to watch it for the sake of the story. To clarify that a little bit, as a DM, I can choose exactly, a DM in person, I can choose exactly what to show you from behind my screen. And it's a little bit hard to do that sometimes with some of what the Game Master has access to and exclusive access to in Fantasy Grounds.
You mentioned it in part there quite a few times, but yeah, you've been talking about how you've been doing a video series, or you are planning a video series with some video game narrative designers, Last Words. Now, I know you've had a few videos up, but you've taken them down recently because you are starting a new game. But yeah, talk about that. Go back to the elevator pitch of Fantasy Grounds, pitch people on Last Words.
Oh, sure, yeah. Well, I'm not sure if it will end up using the Last Words name, but it can be found at my channel, which I'd absolutely appreciate the link to.
Yeah, sure.
Hopefully by the time this gets up, the first game will be out. But yeah, I wanted to open up to more than writers. I felt a little bit like a jerk about making everybody have to be a pro writer to play the game. So I'm starting a more open-ended group, but. So selling them, the pitch is this, and by the way, nobody knows about this except for you. So you got a little bit of an exclusive here. I'm going to run official Wizards of the Coast adventures through Fantasy Grounds and D&D 5th Edition with game industry professionals and entertainment industry professionals. So it bridges a little bit into television and so forth. So they're playing D&D, and the sort of trick that the show has, which others that I've seen do not, is that everything is permadeath. You have one life to live on this show and in this campaign, and if your character is killed, they are gone forever, and everyone drinks in your honor, and you're off the show. My hope is that it will bring some of what you get from watching a real-world sort of drama on TV, where if there's no magic in the world and a character dies, that character is actually dead. And only bad writers tend to cheat that because it sort of robs the moment of its power. So I think it's going to add some additional intensity for these types of people who are good, skilled gamers, but who can't control every throw of the dice.
Wow, that really sounds like I should really watch that as a D&D newbie.
Please do. I think it'll make it significant. I mean, we were talking about Darkest Dungeon, and I can't help but think of Darkest Dungeon fondly when because Darkest Dungeon has character permadeath. When I'm designing this campaign, it may come out under the words under the title Last Words, but it may be called something else. I want to make sure I'm not impinging on anybody's trademarks.
No, fair enough. No, the way you described that pitch, this may be a bit of a weird one to compare it to, but the only comparison that kind of sprung to my head when you were given that kind of pitch was Game of Thrones.
Oh yeah, well, Game of Thrones and Dark Souls, the entire Dark Souls series. Although that is not permadeath, that's that sense of a completely unforgiving world. Darkest Dungeon, I adore that stuff, and I've always had a horror bent all the way back from my Dark Asylum kind of level in Thief 3. It's what my career was launched on, to be honest. People hadn't heard of me before the horror stuff. Fort Frolic in Bioshock 1 was my level, and it's certainly one of the creepiest. So I can't wait to bring that to bear on Ravenloft, which is traditionally Wizards of the Coast, wanted to bring horror to a fantasy setting. So they have a Bram Stoker's Dracula inspired setting called Ravenloft, where a powerful vampire is the antagonist. But really, if a player character dies, like, they'll roll up another one. You guys are all friends and you'll stick together. And that may be true out of game, out of the show. They may play with me again. But on the show, that character is dead forever if a vampire tears off their head, or if they are beset by some sort of blood draining spirit. They're gone. And I think that'll add some edge, potentially also some hurt feelings. I'm going to do my best to try and ensure that doesn't happen, but it'll be quite watchable.
I'm definitely going to be watching now. It'll probably be better than most shit that is on TV these days, anyways.
But I welcome your viewership and your feedback. I'm gonna try to make it suck. It'll be edited because D&D can have moments where people do that kind of what should we do? But the any play relevant moment, people will see it.
Honorable mentions. Go for it.
All right. Well, because I've been mainly talking about new software and new games, I'm going to go way, way back on this one. One of my favorite games of all time is Darklands, which was a very strange sort of proto-Baldur's Gate set in medieval Germany. And it had this just very low magic kind of Game of Thrones tone. The characters, were not sort of flying, fireball throwing, high magic wizards. They were kind of mercenaries trying to work their way through a deeply religious and haunted landscape. And, in the character creation, you can age your character to 80. Their body is decrepit, but they're wise and charismatic, and alchemy is this really sort of strange science that you have to wrap your head around, and you run into little encounters with robber barons and actual Christian demons, which is so rare in a fantasy RPG, and it had a deeply transgressive sense. Its reach exceeded its grasp, but it still managed to grab so much, from somewhat from tabletop, but also certainly exceeded, I think, what other games of its time were doing. Josh Sawyer, who is the lead on Pillars of Eternity, has also apparently cited it as one of his favorites, which I didn't know until recently, but it was formative for me, and I still think about it all the time. It's a little bit of a cheat, but System Shock 2, I later worked at Irrational, but System Shock 2 was a life changer for me. The combination between a strong script with plausible or at least very memorable characters, with first-person mechanics and heavy RPG elements, all of these things were new at the time. Or reasonably new. There had been a System Shock 1, but I hadn't gotten around. I lived in a small town and nobody had told me about it. There was just a constant sense of menace, in part because of Eric Brocious' phenomenal score and soundtrack. And that is one of the games that made me want to do this for a living. The chance to work with Ken Levine and co. many years later was a lifelong dream. Or at least from my teens when I played it.
Obviously the big aspect of System Shock 2 that kind of stands out, at least in terms of when you talk about System Shock 2 to someone, like you mentioned the score and all that there, but like the big one that stands out is Shodan and how villainous she is as a villain, so to speak, as the antagonist.
Yeah, because you are but a microbe in her vast, unforgiving body, and that works on me in a way that no mortal villain sort of monologuing at me from behind glass will ever do. She represents, a sort of unforgiving universe, and yeah, got under my skin, and I was more impressionable then. I won't lie, but yeah, it's I've got a Shodan-shaped scar in my brain somewhere.
I think that is most people's. For me, when I think of AI antagonists, all I can think of is the Colonel from Metal Gear Solid 2, and how that's just completely scarred into my brain. Oh, and I say that as someone who played Metal Gear Solid 2 for the first time in around, how old was I when it came out? 10, 11. So when I encountered that was very scary. So imagine what it would have been like if I had played System Shock 2 at that time.
Well, I wouldn't. You'd be calling me from an asylum. I think is probably how that would have gone down.
Oh,
You'd have to request podcasting privileges.
Any other honorable mentions that stand out for you?
Oh man, well there are a lot. So stop me when I start to bore you. But the Daggerfall. Coming back to Bethesda, another just really, that was one of those games where I knew just little enough about what was possible inside a game, and that game managed to exceed my expectations or redefine them often enough that something broke. Like for a little while, I sort of believed I was there, and like that it was a real enough place for me to lose myself in. Not to say that I was then incarcerated, but like I realized that true immersion was possible. I still remember a moment when I was standing on top some altar, and these were just sprite characters, mine, but for some reason these sprites had what appeared to be physics, and it may have just been a bug, and that's the thing, is that game was legendarily buggy, but 9 patches later, I hit some lich with my sword, which you swung with the mouse, by the way. How antique and charming is that? I hit some lich with my sword, and it plummeted off of the altar and crumbled to a pile of dust, some 30 feet below. And just the idea that the third dimension even mattered to the drama was a huge deal. I'll still remember, too, just this voice. And hearing it stalk you through the main town in that game, just saying, vengeance. Was so good.
Like, I should admit up front, like with most people, I would say the modern Elder Scrolls is kind of where most people made their introduction with, and I'll admit up front that's the same for me with Oblivion and Skyrim. So I've not played Daggerfall, although Bethesda made it free for everyone to play, didn't they, recently?
I believe that is true. Yeah, many years later, they had to find themselves over the course of many years, and they had a very prominent creative figure who is no longer there, and their sort of identity changed a fair amount around that transition. But Arena to Daggerfall to Morrowind, and Morrowind to Oblivion. That you can watch a company sort of find its own quality standard, mainly through just the pain of trial and error. But there was still so much magic to be found. Zach McClendon, my former lead designer from the BioShock 2 team, and a very good friend, wrote a wonderful piece for Wired about how completely fixing Bethesda games would kill them. Like the fact that they reach so far beyond the moon and grab maybe a handful of space dust is what makes them so special, even if their hand comes back radioactive. Like there's sort of beauty in the wild edges of a Bethesda game and the things that might go wrong, because if they were to bulletproof it against all possible bugs, a lot of that freedom would dissolve as well.
I should mention as well, like, because I'm trying to think of the right way to phrase this, but because maybe you mentioned that kind of trial and error, so to speak, with those games, like because like maybe it's the wrong way to phrase it, but because there is these certain bugs you'll find in certain Bethesda RPGs now, like with Oblivion, like with Skyrim, or with Fallout 3 or 4, it's because those bugs or whatever are in there, it makes them more human in a way.
Yeah, more human, and for some of us anyway, and again with my game designer bias showing like a slip, I'll admit that I may not be like everyone in this, but that feeling that you don't know whether the defect that you're currently observing is an artifact of the software breaking down or an aesthetic choice. That sort of romance with the unknown that you can find in a video game melds those two. I adore that. The idea that here there's a way to cheat through a wall, and it became a legend among players. And did the developers intend that one? You never really knew back then. And I granted some of the bugs in an old Bethesda game, I'm sure anyone could tell were unintentional. Skeletons screaming their heads off and running backwards at you down the hall. Not overly intimidating, but funny and memorable. Like, I still haven't forgotten it.
Oh dear. What have you got? One more honorable mention in you?
Oh, maybe. I'm trying to mention things that are far enough apart. Actually, yeah, sure. This one's a little weird but it's still there. Bushido Blade for the original PlayStation. It does dovetail a little bit about what we've been discussing, which is the idea of the unknown as a very deliberate design element. And that was true in Bethesda games to an extent. It was true in Darkest Dungeon, and it's true in Bushido Blade. Because Bushido Blade obfuscates how much health you have left, that purity of a sword fight where you could die at any time, like, spoke to my young brain like nothing else has before or since. I was talking to somebody at Official PlayStation Magazine recently, and like they were like, well, what's an old property that you might want to take control of? And I would love to make a Bushido Blade game. I'm sure fans of Bushido Blade would be like, what the hell did that asshole do with our glorious franchise? Because I am not a fighting game designer, but I don't care. I want to make a game about swords and men chopping each other.
Oh my god, just looking at the screenshots of it on Google just now, like, the name rang a bell, but I was just looking at it, and it was Square Enix that put it out back when it was Squaresoft, and it just looks like fun.
You know what's even crazier with Bushido Blade is that there was a first person mode. Like, it is the worst way to play the game, and nobody who wanted to get competitive ever did it. But the fact that they had it just made me, I just couldn't believe it. Once again, it was like the game was defying the laws of reality beyond the norm, beyond what you just expect from a fictional setting. Like, it is counterintuitive, and you would pretty much lose for no reason. But I think that's kind of how real sword fights were. Nobody knew what they were doing until they'd killed many people, and by then the joy was gone.
Have you played Red Steel at all? Because like that was kind of what interested me in like playing it on Wii, because like it did feel like at the time, and I say this as someone who's obviously never played Bushido Blade, but it kind of looked like it gave the feeling of proper first person sword fighting, at least from the videos initially.
At a party once, for some reason, I don't know. I think I had lost the sort of lost hope that a great sword fighting game would ever be born, and so by the time that came out, it just felt kind of fuzzy to me. Like I did not feel a one-to-one correspondence, and of course the classic issue, which poor Neil Stephenson's Kickstarter about this Clang, I guess, died on this particular hill, which is the issue of connecting, feeling like when you're swinging the thing, you're actually striking something. So after Bushido Blade, what I wanted was the sword fighting game that everybody keeps telling themselves is going to happen. And newly I've heard, oh yeah, it's going to happen in VR with lightsabers. But I'll believe it when I feel it, if you know what I'm saying.
No, I totally get it. I hope we get that proper good sword fighting game one day. It's like you say, it's not just with VR on the corner, but with good motion controllers as well.
Yeah, no, I think what it will be is that someone will force, this newfangled sex toy of a controller into my arthritic fingers. I will put whatever, contacts, the sentient contacts that are the new VR interface will crawl up my face, plop themselves on my eyes, and I will be immersed in the most realistic, convincing sword fighting experience of my life shortly before I flatline. My inner 6-year-old will be invoked seconds before my body gives out.
I think you need to get on the Square Enix about sorting out Bushido Blade again.
Yeah, no, I'll it's just like, call me, guys, call me.
So yeah, top 3 games ever. What would they be? Obviously, D&D would be at the top, but like, how would you fill out that top 3?
Oh God, that's brutal. You actually are going to have to potentially edit out the pause here because that I was not expecting to actually have to rank them. I would say probably oh God. Yeah, this is a tough one, man. Probably Dungeons and Dragons, Deus Ex, and Darklands. I didn't mention Deus Ex in honorable mentions because every fucking guy has waxed poetical about the virtues of that game. But the truth is that without it, the game that I'm about to make would not exist. It is a design influence over me and my ilk, and those guys who made it are still friends of mine today, and I changed me as a designer. So I didn't throw it into the honorable mentions because I figured you would have had it well covered by others.
You could say that again. We had Tom Francis on last year talking about it as his favorite game. So there you go. There's a full episode on that.
Oh yeah, no, I am fully convinced that Tom Francis has a J.C. Denton sex doll in his house. And he's a friend, so I feel comfortable. I at some point I want him to show it to me.
Oh fuck! Oh god, I think I'm gonna pass out just from that.
Just like and like the box cover, it's sort of permanently looking up.
Okay, I'm gonna calm myself down after that. Right, calm down. Right. So moving on then to the Magic Circle then. So moving on from AAA into the indie space, like how did you find that kind of jump? Because like from obviously from that time you were starting to kind of teeter off the edge. You were still at 2K Marin and or Irrational really on Bioshock Infinite, but like yeah, like how did you find that jump, so to speak?
Well, equal parts euphoria and terror. I at first, was sort of awash with the opiates of we can make anything. Unity and the freedom it offers, especially developers making their first independent game, because they don't charge you beyond the lump sum of the pro license, and there is also a free license on top of that. Combined with the fact that we had been making ultra brooding, sort of self-important games for years, and we were about to make something much lighter, or at least we set out to make something much lighter. Stephen Alexander, my business partner that started the company with, was this effects wizard who made Bioshock 1's Water Look So Good and stayed on for Bioshock Infinite. And after shipping that, we all parted ways on pretty good terms to build Question. And we so quickly got to the essence of that game in terms of its, I suppose its soul. Like we knew what it wanted to be about, and there were many stumbles, and we were way outside of our technical expertise, and I'll get to that. But for a while, the honeymoon period was among the sweetest I've ever had, including, by the way, my first game job ever. Like all the wide-eyed innocence people talk about in their first game job. Like I felt that again, really, going into. So I recommend it for that, if nothing else. But the other thing that struck was just how much work people had done on my behalf, often invisibly in AAA for years. That all the details of running a business and marketing and testing and sort of negotiating with the state, like all of these jobs, which were carefully curated away from my kind of stream of experience in AAA, were suddenly mine or Stevens. And that was overwhelming, and continues, by the way, to be, just the source of very real stress. Our company will survive our very niche debut, but it has been a ride. And I won't go too deep on that unless you want more detail. With I have found that the agility that a small team making exactly what they want to make is second to none. And we were able to build something so much more ambitious than three people should have been able to because of that. But there has been a very heavy price. Like we are so limited in what we can do outside of the creative work, and to an extent inside. We're limited to our own talent set and the number of hours per day, and trying to have families and live like people in tandem with all that. The indie romance is often applied to the young, that before they have any commitments. When you try to do it later in your career, like us, like we have, on the one hand, you have world-class contacts. On the other, you just have fewer hours, or at least fewer hours without wrecking the life that you've built with whomever, right? So it has been conflicted but very fulfilling so far.
Like you mentioned just in part there, excuse me. Like with before, like you were just doing narrative and creative side of things, like with Bioshock 2 and all that there. Whereas now you're trying to juggle a lot more balls, so to speak. Like, you have a business to handle, you have marketing, QA, and all that there to handle. Like, how do you find those kind of pressures now that you have a few more hurdles to juggle than just, like, say, narrative or whatever?
Well, first, and hopefully, I touched on this, but my respect for the people who do that kind of work on both sides, by the way, the external shops that we sort of deal with for mocap, say, for example, like, my respect for anybody who has done a job that I am now doing badly has increased 20-fold. So the first part is that I'm just much humbler, I think, and then secondarily, like, I like being brought out of my comfort zone on a limited basis. I would say that we're now reaching the edges of that sort of second orbit where I'm starting to feel like my experience is so irrelevant to what I am being asked to do that I worry that it's prone to error. But I love being forced to learn. I think it keeps you young, and I have definitely undergone a transformation as a result. And I think I am more appreciative of the tolerance of my wife and my son, the patience and the contributions that they make. I don't think that stuff would have occurred to me on the same scale in AAA. Like, because I never had to ask for much. And that some of this may just be a function of me reaching that phase of life. So I don't know if it's entirely about going indie, but I do think that it has brought what truly matters to me into striking clarity, because I have to divide carefully the hours that I have in a day between all of these people who I love dearly, and inevitably I'm failing someone. When I go to sleep, I'm like, oh, yep, that was the one I failed today. I'll have to tweet and say sorry tomorrow or whatever.
So with the Magic Circle, obviously, like, the through line on that is that players take on their QA tester who is working on basically vaporware at this point. And I was watching an EGX talk you gave a few years ago back at Eurogame Expo. I think it was 2 years ago. And you mentioned some of the kind of vaporware inspirations at that time, like Last Guardian and Duke Nukem Forever. But there's another. But as I was watching that, there's another game that sprang to mind, and I think it's safe to say that. Let me reword this. Like, it's a game that you've been involved in, and it was a game that at one point I was actually very excited to see more of. And that was the XCOM FPS, which eventually became the Bureau XCOM. But that kind of became a kind of vaporware in itself. So, like, with the Magic Circle, was that kind of an influence, so to speak, or am I looking at all the wrong aspects here in terms of XCOM?
Well, I have to be careful because I am very close with people who are still inside that company, and so what I have traditionally said about the Bureau is that I was the wrong guy, and that is very much true. Like, I was moved off of a new IP, which I was very excited about. The BioShock 2 sort of leads team was going to make a new thing together, and moved off of that to help the Bureau, and we felt enough guilt sort of not being able to help while on the new thing that we said yes, but my biases in particular are not super well suited to something of the XCOM legacy, and although I adore those games as a player, like, I'm just not the guy who was going to design the brilliant strategy game. The experience of every AAA game that I've ever worked on influenced the Magic Circle in some way. The Bureau, to an extent, I guess, but not especially more, because actually one of the things that was the most challenging for the Bureau is that the sort of leader changed so many times. Whereas the specific thing I was looking to lampoon a little bit in the Magic Circle is the idea of the god auteur who talks himself into something and then out of something over the course of way too many years. The capitalizes on all that credibility and eventually runs out of it with the fan base. A very personal relationship. And I myself I've been guilty of that too. Like we talked about this or that at the beginning of BioShock 2. For whatever reason, we were unable to get this or that feature into the game or this or that narrative element, and people say like, "What the hell?" But we actually shipped the game, and the fictional character of Ishgilder, who calls himself Starfather in the fiction of the Magic Circle, has failed to ship a game for 20 years, and people actually only assume that you're a QA tester when they talk to you in the world of the game, but you actually turn out to be something more mysterious, and that kind of goes to spoiler country, but. I like that idea, and I have for a long time as a level designer, of hovering over a world, looking down at these poor AI who are waiting for their story to start, and they look up at me saying like, "Hey, a-hole, can we please get on with it? Are you ever going to ship this thing?" There felt like there was sort of a Pixar charm there, and I couldn't really act on it until years later as an indie.
No, fair enough. I totally get that. Personally speaking, I'm quite saddened that the FPS XCOM didn't pan out. I was really interested in how that was going, so really saddened that didn't pan out, but at least there was the Bureau.
Oh, there's a lot of love into various incarnations of it, yeah, over the years, and same here. Like we all wanted more for it. I think that's safe to say. I know that my biases as a writer and narrative designer are just sort of at odds with what made XCOM so special in the first place. And I am super bad at explaining the motives of aliens that would kneel behind cover and fire laser rifles. Like that, the core absurdity of that just makes me laugh out loud. And so, like, without turning it into a comedy, which would ruin it for fans of the XCOM brand, like I was struggling the entire time. No. But fortunately, what we actually shipped was not really my overall doing, and so I really can't comment hugely on how they got there. My time on the project was actually not that long.
Oh, fair enough. Like how do you see, how as a fan? I don't know. It's like, how do you view XCOM now, especially with Jake Solomon in the chair with the tactical?
Oh my god, I adore the Firaxis take on XCOM. I was not, like, I'll admit, like, and this was another sort of difficulty I had trying to work on any version of it, is I had not played it back in the day. And so I respected it in terms of its sort of overall effect on design thinking. But Jake and his team have helped me fall in love with XCOM, almost naively, almost like a millennial might. So I'm partway through the second game and loving it, and I just top-down turn-based tactical games are my jam, man. I play the heck out of them, and they're really honing that to a sort of molecular edge.
I really want to play XCOM 2, but my PC's just kind of falling apart at this point.
Yeah. No, they're swankier than the average tactical. Like that's very true. I would, if you haven't played Card Hunter, I would strongly recommend Card Hunter as a brilliant alternative that does not bring any kind of machine to its knees.
You mentioned it in part there just a few minutes ago, but
actually, wait, I'm gonna interrupt you real quick. I want to, you can use this or not use this, but I want to give an honorable mention to Card Hunter.
Okay.
So. The reason why I didn't list it at first is because my time with it was a very specific year. But in terms of hours played, money spent, like every possible, metric of investment that I have to offer, like it deserves a place sort of among the gods. And so my son was born, and he slept a lot on my shoulder, and I wanted something that I could play with one hand, just simple clicks, right? But that did not lack for depth. And Card Hunter is this brilliant intersection between, interestingly, given the topic of this podcast, Dungeons and Dragons, computer games, card games, and tacticals. So Card Hunter, and forgive me if I'm explaining to you a thing you already know, but it is a party-based tactical RPG where all of your powers come from gear that you equip, and they're all really well-designed cards, like you would find in Magic the Gathering or another collectible card game. And it really helps you come up with these clever combinations that would not occur to you without that sort of sense of a discrete rule that you get in a card. And the scenarios are devious, and a huge amount of the content in the game is free. Like you can play and enjoy for free, and it waits on you. It is a truly turn-based game that you can consume at your own pace. And I just lost myself in it. I went from consuming every single quest in the single-player game to finishing every single challenge in the single-player game, like 5-starring every mission, which is not easy to do. And then I went into competitive multiplayer, and I hate competitive multiplayer. So it really, it's a game I played like no other, and that asked things of me that none other has. And I really can't recommend it enough, because again, it's sort of, as counterpoint to Fantasy Grounds, right? You can play this one for free, and don't be scared by the free-to-play thing. Every single card in that game you can get by just playing the game in single player, doing missions. There's no exclusive stuff. It's all just one big database.
I might just look into that after we're done here tonight.
Yeah, man. Co-founder of Irrational left to make that game, and it's quietly brilliant. They're not big self-promoters, but I adore them and I love their game.
I might look into that.
Yeah, I enjoy.
So back to the Magic Circle then. Yeah, you mentioned that yourself kind of a few minutes ago, but they kind of touched back on it properly. You mentioned the GDC of the game being unsustainable. Like you said something about 16,000 units being sold overall, and in part as well, like how Lampoon Modern Games Development kind of put off some reviewers. Like, what lessons have you learned from that experience with the Magic Circle for what you're making next?
That is a very sort of tricky question for me, because in terms of external feedback, I've honestly learned almost nothing, because almost every strong opinion leveled by one person is immediately counteracted by an equal and opposite reaction by somebody else. So like matter and antimatter, they just sort of explode, leaving me in a smoking hole. The thing that the Magic Circle ultimately has been is profoundly cathartic. We told the truth from our perspective via that game, and for some people it is like nothing else, and they write us, and knowing that we touched those people for whom that game apparently was made is a transcendent experience, because we compromised nothing. It was us really chasing the muse, and you need to do that once or twice if you dare to call yourself a creative on Earth. But sort of from a much more pragmatic perspective, we have to move on from that impulse and fast to survive. We have bills to pay, and so the good part is that none of us are design snobs. We love big genre games. Steven got completely lost in The Witcher 3. You've heard me go on and on about large AAA releases like what Bethesda does, and wax rhapsodic about it. So moving on to something that more people can clearly wrap their heads around in the pitch, it's no large loss. We had something that we needed to allow to see the light, and it has, and that's good. And on Steam is really rough for short games, and it's even rougher for games that are hard to explain. And the Magic Circle is both. And so we're moving on. You asked about stuff that I'd like to promote. By May 10th, the PlayStation 4 version of the Magic Circle will be out, and possibly also the Xbox One version, where we're certainly targeting simultaneous. So if any of your listeners are remotely interested in console play, we've been told that the default curation that indie games on consoles are still enjoying, because it's so hard to actually get one there, leads to significantly better sales. So we're hoping that Magic Circle sees a second win. So, yeah, like in case this is useful, Magic Circle is the story of a legendary piece of vaporware of which you are the hero, and you decide to steal the tools of game design from the incompetent fictional developers to repair their game from the inside and ultimately release it yourself. It's coming to PlayStation 4 and Xbox One by roughly May 10th of this year. And I hope you dig it. It is like nothing else. If you've ever wanted to sort of experiment with the idea of being a game designer, but you're either too lazy or too deep into your own career, or you really just want to put your toe in, the Magic Circle gives you some of that feeling, but kind of like what game design should have been from the perspective of a kid. It's cool, and we've got a great cast: Ashley Birch from Borderlands, James Urbaniak from the Venture Brothers. Stephen Russell from Fallout 4, just really great people who bring a lot to the story. On Twitter, I am at NULLSPEAK, Nullspeak. So you can find me there and tell me about your D&D experiences, or if you play the Magic Circle, how you sort of made it through the ending, which I won't spoil.
Thanks for listening to My Favourite Game. Next week, the first of a 2-part season finale, Catherine Woolley on Shenmue. Until next week, bye bye.